Why is mass murder by chemical weapons considered more heinous than mass murder by other means, guns, bombs, etc.? There are a few reasons, both historical and legal, that matter, so bear with me for this mini-essay. Simply put, the use of chemical weapons violates the law of war. More specifically, the use of chemical weapons violates the Chemical Weapons Convention of 1993. Conventional weapons are given more leeway, legally speaking, in conflicts under international law. See the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons. It's not really so much about their efficiency, rather it's about how brutal they are. Blister weapons, nerve gases and their cousins are not pleasant ways to die. They aren't usually containable, meaning that once you fire them, the environment determines how far they spread, who they affect, and finally chemical weapons can have a long-term environmental impact on areas, causing long-term injuries and death after the conflict has ended. Think of them like invisible landmines, where even in decades post-conflict they can still maim and kill unintended targets. Historically, of course, examples of chemical weapon attacks only reinforce the brutality of the weapons. World War I, the Halabja poison gas attack during the 1988 Iran-Iraq War. But I also wanted to point out something about the way you phrased the question. Mass murder during conflict with any sort of weapon is generally considered fairly heinous, i.e. war crime. The killing of soldiers or large amount of soldiers during a conflict is not legally mass murder, moral questions aside. So it's tricky because mass murder is a crime either way you cut it. Generally speaking, the mass slaughter of civilians by any sort of weapon sparks outrage and in the worst cases intervention, except Rwanda, Darfur, most of Kosovo, etc. For more information, check out the 4th Geneva Convention on the Protection of Civilians. The current situation in Syria, presuming that's what sparked the interest, is not just about the use of chemical weapons, though it's certainly a major part. It's that the Syrian government deployed the weapons against its own civilians. That's a massive problem in international law for the reasons I've listed above. Well put. People tend to scoff at the idea of international norms, general consensus of behavior, actually working, but in the case of chemical weapons, the norm solidified into a legal framework recognized by most states in the international system. We went from widespread chemical weapons use in World War I to the Geneva Protocol in 1925. The text of the document cites international opinion as the basis for the ban. Whereas the use in war of asphyxiating, poisonous or other gases, and of all analogous liquids, materials or devices, has been justly condemned by the general opinion of the civilized world. This initial consensus around a particular behavior transformed into a legal framework that was still being developed at the end of the century in 1993's Chemical Weapons Convention. Syria is actually not a state party to the Chemical Weapons Convention, so it really has no legal bearing here. They have signed on to the Geneva Protocol of 1925, but it's unclear whether that really applies here since it seems to apply only to interstate war, although an international lawyer could probably provide more clarity on this point. It's that the Syrian government deployed the weapons against its own civilians. Has there been evidence shown that it was the government? Just curious, because I haven't seen anything. Syria is not a signatory/member of the Chemical Weapons Convention, nor is Israel. Just like the US is not a member of the International Criminal Court and not a signatory of the Mine Ban Treaty. The US holds that because it has not signed, it is not legally bound to not use landmines or develop them. This is true of a lot of different treaties that the US has not signed, including later Geneva Conventions. Some of the actions we have taken during our war on terror were breaches of a later Geneva Convention, but given that we had not signed it, was not a crime? Given that Syria is not a member, does that affect the legal ramifications of using chemical weapons? ESP, since it's within their own borders. Steven Pinker talks about this in The Better Angels of Our Nature, particularly in the section, Is the Long Peace a Nuclear Peace? Here are some relevant excerpts. It's not immediately obvious why, out of all the weapons of war, poison gas was singled out as uniquely abominable, as so uncivilized that even the Nazis kept it off the battlefield. They clearly had no compunction about using it elsewhere. It's highly unpleasant to be gassed, but then it's just as unpleasant to be perforated or shredded by pieces of metal. As far as numbers are concerned, gas is far less lethal than bullets and bombs. In World War I, fewer than 1% of the men who were injured by poison gas died from their injuries, and these fatalities added up to less than 1% of the war's death toll. One possibility is that the human mind finds something distinctively repugnant about poison. Whatever suspension of the normal rules of decency allows warriors to do their thing, it seems to license only the sudden and directed application of force against an adversary who has the potential to do the same. Even pacifists may enjoy war movies or video games in which people get shot, stabbed, or blown up, but no one seems to get pleasure from watching a greenish cloud descend on a battlefield and slowly turn men into corpses. The poisoner has long been reviled as a uniquely foul and perfidious killer. Poison is the method of the sorcerer rather than the warrior, of the woman, with her terrifying control of kitchen and medicine chest, rather than the man. Whatever abhorrence of poisoning we might have inherited from our evolutionary or cultural past, it needed a boost from historical contingency to become entrenched as a taboo on the conduct of war. Price conjectures that the critical non-event was that in World War I, poison gas was never deliberately used against civilians. At least in that application, no taboo-shattering precedent had been set, and the widespread horror in the 1930s about the prospect that gas-dispensing airplanes could annihilate entire cities rallied people into categorically opposing all uses of the weapons. TLDR: poison gas is taboo because poison is a dishonorable weapon and people are afraid of mass gassing of civilians, i.e. the parade scene in 1989 Batman. This is great. I just wanted to add to this to address why we might make something taboo in the first place. Pinker also talks about this in the book to some extent and has dealt with the psychology of taboo extensively elsewhere. The logic for this was first worked out by Thomas Schelling, I think, in his book The Strategy of Conflict. The basic idea is that bargaining and negotiation rely on clearly delineated focal points. It can be demonstrated mathematically that focal points must be discrete, categorical events, e.g., chemical weapons versus conventional weapons.